And now I'm happy to have the opportunity to introduce David Vallee. In addition to being the father of 2 sets of twins, David is the hydrologist-in-charge of the National Weather Service's Northeast River Forecast Center. The center provides water resources and life-saving flood forecasting services to hundreds of federal, state, and local water resource partners throughout New York, New England, neighboring Canada. David's worked for the National Weather Service for 34 years and has extensive experience leading hydrometeorological forecast and warning operations and directing weather research and training programs. He's considered the expert, the go-to guy, the rock star when it comes to all things weather, and especially understanding and responding to climate change. Rainfall and temperature trends on flooding and severe weather, and the behavior of New England's hurricanes. He is a recipient of many awards, including the prestigious National Isaac Klein Award for Leadership. You may have seen David on the Weather Channel, the History Channel, or the Discovery Channel, and we're honored to have him here with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming David Vallee. David, hi.
Good evening. Thank you very much. First, the sound check. You can hear me loud and clear, I hope.
I can.
Okay, excellent. Second, a shout out to Lynn for giving me the opportunity this evening to be able to address you all. So now the technical challenge. We all keep our fingers crossed as we go to the mighty screen share. Let's see here. I want to make sure that I grab the right screen. Okay. All right, let's see here. And let's try this. And let's try this. And then let's do this. So hopefully you are all seeing the opening slide.
No, I got knocked off.
No, it's your Zoom.
It says more than meetings. It's a Zoom slide.
Ah, okay, you're seeing that. All right, let's see. Let me try this again.
Yeah, we got you.
This is a first.
We were seeing your David Vallee is sharing his screen. So
okay, so let's try this again. Maybe I might have had too many windows open. It's interesting. For some reason, it's not showing. It's not showing what I want it to.
Ah, there you go.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Now, can you see the slide deck? Can you see the first slide?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, that worked. Very interesting. I've done these Zoom meetings 100 times, and every time it seems the configuration is a little different. All right, so hopefully you are all seeing one of our tropical visitors this past summer. One of the memorable ones with landfalling Henri coming across southeast Connecticut, southwest Rhode Island on its way across the state. And some of the classic characteristics with those bands of heavy rain moving inland, hitting the Housatonic Valley, not once, not twice, but as you see there with the eye wall remnants 3 times. And then, of course, the rainfall image on the right is the just horrific amount of rainfall that Ida brought to portions of Virginia, eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and southern New England. So when Lynn and I chatted about having me come out and speak again this evening on this topic, we thought this was not only timely, but also of great significance. I've been living in this part of New England my entire life, and it is much different than what I remember growing up in the late 60s, early 70s when I was a kid. And my river center, of course, forecasts not only what comes out of the atmosphere, the meteorology, but we have to forecast what that water is going to do when it hits the ground. That's the hydrology. So when we start looking at how floods have been behaving the last 30, 40 years, the rainfall, the magnitude of rainfall, the frequency of these big events, every one of those elements, my river center is going to be one of the first to know if things are changing, because we use our historical record to help us calibrate our hydrologic models. But when Mother Nature starts changing the behavior of the weather systems and the way it rains, the way it snows, that changes the way the rivers and streams respond. So a good chunk of this presentation is going to talk to this changing behavior of some of our weather systems, like our tropical systems. But I'm going to start off first with just a really quick 5-minute tour again about our changing climate, because I think it's important to kind of have a baseline of what we do know scientifically is happening around us and has been trending around us. And then we'll jump into this changing behavior with the tropical storms. Why Henri and Ida, I don't think are exceptions to the rule anymore. I think this is more the common aspect of what we're going to be seeing in the coming years and decades. And then I want to end with a little bit of your tax dollars very, very busily at work and show you what we as a weather service are trying to move toward to help communities like the ones you live in to fend off and better prepare for the floods. So in about 15 minutes, we're going to give you the blast furnace or the fire hose of information. But I am available to you as long as you need me this evening for your questions. So let us jump right in. Where does it all begin? Meteorologically speaking, it's all about the jet stream. And it's all about how changes in the ice cover in the Arctic are having a sensible impact on the behavior of our jet stream, which drives the storm track. What you're seeing here in the loop on the right is a loop from the late 1980s, 1984 in particular, through 2016, of the dramatic change in the amount of ice cover on at the North Pole in the month of September. Why September? September is the month in the year where we typically see the least amount of ice cover. And you'll notice in this loop how dramatic the change is from 1984 to the end of the loop in 2016. This is representative of our atmosphere and our globe warming, the loss of the Arctic ice. Now, just because there's a dramatic minimum in September, some may think that's not a big deal. But what's really happening is we're not only reducing the amount of ice cover helps the atmosphere, or I should say helps the Earth radiate long-wave radiation back out to space. It's sort of the planetary balance, balancing incoming radiation from the sun that heats the Earth and the Earth's ability to radiate that warmth back out into space. When you reduce the ice cover, you reduce the duration of ice cover, you reduce the thickness of the ice that does grow during the winter months. You change the Earth's ability to radiate energy away. And the reason why this relationship is changing is because of the amount of chemicals such as the carbon dioxide, methane, other elements like that that are now causing a blanket, if you will, an invisible blanket to surround the Earth. And it is changing the way the Earth is able to radiate some of that energy back out into space. And that is, in essence, the loss of the ice pack up north, like we're seeing on the Arctic, is having a sensible impact in the weather patterns around our hemisphere, how the weather systems are moving to and from. So to me, this is a very key player in seeing this much dramatic ice loss when we get to the end of the summer season in the Northern Hemisphere. And the fact that while the ice does regrow, it's not nearly as thick, it's not nearly as reflective, and that all changes that thermal balance. The amount of heat coming into the Earth's system and the Earth's ability to radiate some of that radiation back out. That blanket caused by things like fossil fuels, methane, carbon dioxide, all that, are causing less of that radiation to be able to escape. And it's causing it to bend back and be received back on the Earth's surface. Hence, warming oceans, warming atmosphere. Now, how is it manifesting itself? Interestingly, it's manifesting itself around the hemisphere by the presence of a change in the jet stream flavor, slower moving weather systems, a blocked up atmosphere. And the frequency of these blocky patterns lasting weeks to months at a time have become more frequent. And there are researchers in the US that have documented this by looking at the amount of curvature in the jet stream from the 1950s to present. And mathematically, it's a significant change. The way we are sensibly seeing this is through the changing behavior of our weather systems, slower moving systems, the region getting stuck in a rut where we could go weeks without appreciable precipitation. One extreme that the state of Connecticut suffered through in 2015 and 16 with a significant agriculture meteorological drought. The other aspect of this, however, slow moving single systems like a Sandy, or getting hit in succession, like the region suffered through in March of 2010, with record rainfall across the region and catastrophic flooding in parts of Southeast Connecticut, Rhode Island, Eastern Massachusetts, where we had 4 major rain events in 5 weeks. We have all lived through this. We're all seeing this behavior. So should it have been any surprise that we saw Henri and Ida, that we saw those systems preceded by the remnants of Fred, and beyond that? So this is kind of the new theme that we have been watching transpire over us. So the jet stream is a player in this. The other aspect is that when you warm the atmosphere, you warm the ocean, the atmosphere now, through that extra warmth, is able to hold greater quantities of water vapor. And what you're seeing here in this loop is simply an analysis of water vapor in the atmosphere. These deep orange and yellow bands that you see, such as through the tropics, in these filaments that are lifting up toward Alaska or missing New England and heading off the coast, these are what we call tropical plumes. These things have always been circulating the globe, but what we are seeing now is higher quantities of moisture in these plumes. And these plumes are being advected farther northward into our region with greater frequency. So we're seeing them a little more often. We're seeing them with greater water vapor. And because of the nature of the storm tracks that affect New England, our weather systems have more opportunities to interact with them. And that is leading to this vicious cycle of these big storms, horrific rainfall events, and increased flood frequency over much of my service area of New York and New England. So the grassroots sensible impact of all of these ingredients coupled together across the Northeast is increased annual precipitation, increased frequency of really intense rainfall events, warming temperatures generally when you look at the average temperatures for the year, and wildly varying snowfall. So keep in mind, we expect variability in the weather patterns. We expect that some years will be drier than others. We expect some winters to be colder and more snowy than others. That's weather variability. The climate signal is the long-term trend. The fact that over long durations of time, we can identify clear trends in these particular elements. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you very briefly. Now, when we talk rainfall, it's all about stormwater. It's all about flood frequency. It's all about design, how we've developed the infrastructure over the decades. We have seen so much of a shift now in how it's raining that we're actually able to quantify just how different a 1% or 100-year rainfall event is now compared to the 1950s. Unfortunately, we've built a lot of our infrastructure off how things were calculated and how the nature was dumping rain on us back in the 1950s and 60s. And that's part of the struggle that our communities are having. The fact that the infrastructure isn't designed for the way nature is throwing these rain events at us, whether it be over the course of an entire year or it be these instantaneously crazy rain events that we're seeing. And the net result of all of this is the system can't handle it. And we're seeing trends to increased flood magnitude or frequency, and in some places, both the magnitude of flooding, the intensity, severity of it, and the frequency of having a flood. And this is most pronounced in the smaller urbanized watersheds, especially along the I-95 corridor, but also in areas of terrain. The Housatonic Valley is one of those where you get a northeaster and easterly wind, you're going to get a little extra boost because of your terrain. And when you couple that with slow-moving weather systems and more moisture available in the atmosphere, you have the potential to see much more precipitation than what we might have expected, say, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So what does it look like? Well, for the state of Connecticut as a whole, we'll start with temperature. You're looking at the annual average temperature for the year from 1930 to 2020. The trend is unmistakable. But what really catches my eye is two things. First, look at the frequency of these really, really warm years since about 1980. The 12 warmest years on record in the state of Connecticut have all occurred since 1990. And look at the absence of cold. Let me put it this way. The coldest year that we have experienced in Connecticut in the last 40 years is still warmer than the old average annual temperature. That's a dramatic shift, and it impacts everything from length of growing season to duration of snow on the ground to the vegetation, insects, bird life. It crosses all the domains. That's how dramatic the shift has been. We see it, anecdotally, the number of days above 90 degrees. When we have these really warm years, we see a lot of days above 90. The absence of days where we get below zero, so much less than they were, say, 50 to 70 years ago. So we are warming. The data speaks volumes. With respect to precipitation, for Connecticut, it's a little bit more challenging to define. Yes, there is a discernible trend. Over the long term, the state is wetter. On average, depending on where you look, it's around a ½ inch increase per every 10 years. But what really speaks in Connecticut is you are so dependent on storm track, and storm tracks will vary from year to year. So when we get into a blocky pattern, we have to look at what the background state of the storm track is. Is it one that's favorable to producing a lot of rain, like we saw in 2011 or we saw in 2018? Or is it one like we got stuck in 2015 and 16, where we had a long, pronounced 2-year period of much below normal precipitation? So for Connecticut, it is, yes, wetter on average, but to me, it's more about this remarkable twerking from one extreme to the other that the state is having to deal with. And we'll talk very briefly about droughts, but it's the same way. So what's really challenging in looking at this for the state of Connecticut is when we have those wet years, they're super wet. And typically we're getting very, very remarkably intense rainfall amounts during these wet years. So it's both, when we are wet, it's very intense, both short duration and longer term rainfall. Are we incapable of having a drought? No, that hasn't changed, but the type and behavior of the droughts have changed, and we'll see that in a moment. Now, we talk about the intense precipitation events. On the left is a graph that shows you the frequency of just having a 1-inch rainfall in a 24-hour period of time from 1930 to 2020. I should say, why 1930? Simply because we wanted to look at this from a river forecasting standpoint. And most of the river gauges that we forecast for have a history of having been installed back in the late 1920s through the mid 1930s. So I just arbitrarily picked 1930 to maximize the river gauge database that we have from the U.S. Geological Survey. But you can see here in this scatter plot that there is certainly an increased concentration of getting more than 15 1-inch days a year. Just one way of looking at intense rainfall events. But what really speaks to the severity issue, just look at the flash flood inducing rainfall events in the last 8 to 10 years. Long Island, New York, August 13, 11 inches in 3 hours. An inch in 8 minutes on the Long Island Expressway. How about Connecticut? September 25th, 2018, the remnants of Florence, which put Westport, Connecticut underwater. 5 to 7 inches of rain came down that evening at rush hour in a 3-hour period of time. Manchester, Connecticut, when that eye wall on that loop I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, when that eye wall went through Manchester, it dumped 4 to 6 inches of rain in just a couple of hours, producing significant flooding. Why so much flooding? Because they had been wet. We had been in a very wet pattern. Why? Because we had been stuck in that pattern of having one event after another, after another. And then just a few weeks later came Ida, dropping a remarkable 3.15 inches of rain in just 1 hour in New York City, and resulting in a heartbreaking loss of life in an urban setting, in an inner city urban setting. So where does this put us when we start talking about how we move the water? Well, if we just zoom in on the Housatonic Valley, this is the new NOAA Atlas that was produced back in 2016 and published shortly thereafter. This is one example of the rich data that exists in that atlas. And I just happen to pull out one example, the 1% 24-hour rainfall amount. In other words, statistically, what rainfall should I be designing for if my target is being able to deal with a rainfall value that has a 1% chance of occurring any day in the year? That's the definition of a 100-year event. It's what we call a 1% recurrence interval. Well, for your area of Connecticut, if that's your target, we should be designing systems to be able to deal with 9 inches of rain if you're designing for the 100-year event. Unfortunately, what we designed for, and no fault of anyone, it was the best science we had at the time. What much of the region's designed for is more like 6 to 7 inches of rain. And you can break this down to different intervals. You can go hour, 6 hour, 1 day, 2 day, 5 day. And you'll see these same types of statistics pop up. That it really speaks to the fact that Mother Nature's turned the tide just enough with respect to how it rains and the frequency of these big rain events, that part of our struggle, especially in the urbanized corridor, is that we just haven't built the infrastructure to be able to deal with this effectively. And so the challenge of a lot of these flood events. And it manifests itself in where we see the flooding occurring. But it also begins to point toward some of the practices out there that actually do work in the face of a changing climate. So if we just look at the western part of Connecticut, we have the Housatonic Valley is these points here on the right-hand side. Beacon Falls, of course, is on the Naugatuck. But you notice Great Barrington, Falls Village, okay, Gaylordsville, increased flooding over the last 40 years. This is a comparison of, you know, looking at the percent increase in the number of flood events, not magnitude, just the number of events, prior to 1970, post 1970. And you see a fairly sizable increase in the number of floods the region's been experiencing. Why Beacon Falls and the Naugatuck has actually gone dramatically down? One reason, flood control. Army Corps of Engineers, big dam up the river. And they are able to hold back the tide of these big rain events. Why? Because the Corps of Engineers developed those flood control reservoirs to handle big back-to-back events, 6 to 8 inch runoff events. It's not rainfall, that's the runoff from rainfall. So flood control is one way that has proven the test of time. Another way that has proven the test of time are areas such as the Charles River Basin in eastern Massachusetts, where 12 communities gave back land in the late 1960s. So the Corps of Engineers could restore that land back to its natural state. It's called natural valley storage. There too, we have actually seen a reduction in the frequency of flooding. So just an example of a couple of best practices that have stood the test of time so far. With respect to drought, the drought picture is unique for Connecticut because of the storm track and how it affects the behavior of weather over the state. It's not that we are not going to see or won't see these big droughts anymore. 2015-16 certainly illustrated that. But what we do see is they are a little less frequent, especially multi-year droughts. And these tend to come on much more quickly than they used to. And by quickly, I mean the state of Connecticut has gone from flooding in very wet state in March or April, and then it not raining in May and June, to where we have so little rainfall. So again, it speaks to this vicious cycle of going from one extreme to the other. That makes it truly challenging to plan and prepare for these large swings in variability. But it speaks to the challenges that we face, going this one extreme to another. So let's bring this down quickly to our tropical cyclones, right? What has changed? Well, we used to see rapidly accelerating hurricanes, but as I'll show you in a minute, they've become less frequent. We're seeing slower moving systems, and that speaks to changes in the jet stream. You couple that with the increased frequency of these high moisture plumes coming into the region, and it results in these catastrophic events that we've all been living through, not just this past summer, but over the last 20, 25 years. So here's just a quick table showing all the different tropical systems that impacted the region back to 1938. And what I want to point your attention to is the number of those where the forward motion is over 30 miles an hour, really fast moving tropical systems. The two that were related to some of the biggest riverine floods we had, Diane in 1955 and Irene in 2011. And look at how slowly they were moving, 15 to 20 miles an hour. So that's a calling card for, we're going to have a flood problem with a slow moving system. Look at the different behavior in the past 10 years. Look at the number of systems that were rapidly accelerating. Only 3 of them, Andrea, Isaiah, and Elsa. All of the others were moving slower than the average that we had historically seen in New England. And if you look, almost every one of them produced torrential rainfall and significant flooding. Irene, Fred, Henri, Ida, every one of them. Florence, another great example, September 25th, 2018, with that catastrophic rainfall, nearly 7 inches of rain in 12 hours. and fresh water, this breaks your heart to have to see fire and rescue crews risking their lives to get people out of harm's way in the midst of one of these dramatic floods. So this, particular area was just a little bit south. The core was just a little bit south of our forecast point on the Yantic River, Yantic. But you see how that major flood translates to what's happening on the ground. Well, Florence wouldn't be the last one. We know Henri did something similar. And Ida came just a couple of weeks later. Again, major flooding and torrential rainfall to the tune of 5 to 10 inches of rain over parts of the area. But there are best practices that are out there that are working. I've spoken to Natural Valley Storage. Another activity that's becoming quite common, some of the old textile facilities that are being transitioned into condominium complexes. This is one example from Rhode Island on the Patuxent River, where when the developers came in and bought this particular area of real estate and turned it into condos, one of the first things they did was they recognized the flood threat and the increasing flood threat. So the first 2 floors of these factories now are where the parking is. So they can let the river do its thing and not lose any of the infrastructure, not lose any of the critical systems by getting them all elevated and up on the higher floors. Another example is where you've got hardened infrastructure. Sometimes you just got to get it higher out of the floodplain. You got to raise it. One example there from Chelsea, Massachusetts. And then, of course, on a smaller scale, very beneficial projects, things like bioswales and porous pavement, ways of kind of locally stemming the tide of a flood problem or a local water concern. But all of these practices continue to be beneficial and are providing communities ways to proactively fight this fight when we get in these wet patterns to try to protect their communities and make them more resilient against some of these catastrophic flood events. So I want to end very briefly with just giving you a snippet of where we are going as a National Weather Service toward the implementation of what we're calling real-time forecast flood inundation forecasts. We are now going to take our forecast that you see in the form of a hydrograph, such as the Housatonic River at Great Barrington, for example, and translating that into an actual analysis of where that water is going to be on the ground for our emergency managers. So my river center was selected back at the end of 2019 to champion this effort. It started in Texas following Hurricane Harvey, and my office was selected to increase the coverage of these new services. And I was on the hook to conduct 2 tabletop exercises. We selected Rhode Island and New York for obvious reasons, the March 2010 flood, and of course, Tropical Storm Irene. We worked with the emergency management community, put together 2 half-day tabletop exercises. And what we did is we took our forecasts from those 2 events, and we tested this new methodology of translating my official forecast, like you see at Cranston, into the aerial extent of the inundation, like you see on the right. But we also have this new tool called the National Water Model, which is complementary to my river center's modeling by way of being able to capture many of the small rivers and streams for us. So we were able to provide a snapshot of what the inundation would look like, not just on the larger rivers like the Connecticut or the Housatonic, but to do this on all of the small rivers and streams throughout the Northeast and New York State. And again, we were focused for our tabletops in Rhode Island and New York. And basically what we did is we took our partners through a normal sequence of events for a flood. We'd give them a weather briefing like the weather offices do today. We provided them the hydrographs, the known impact statements that we've developed for these forecast locations. But then we showed them the new service, which looks like this. Actual forecasts of where that water is going to be on the ground. And these pictures are truly worth 1,000 words, showing the remarkable impact on the infrastructure and on this particular river reach in the Patuxent. But to the emergency managers, they told us that this is a game changer, that if we can get to a point where during flood events, we are able to provide them these forecasts out to perhaps 2 days in advance, what a leg up they will have on being able to better prepare their communities for what's coming. I'll leave you with a real-time example. During Ida, we were running this behind the scenes in an experimental prototype mode. When we do that, we're not sharing it with partners necessarily because we have to take the time to train them, to work through tabletops, et cetera. But we were running this in the background so we could go back and validate the accuracy of both the technique and the forecasts. So what you're seeing here, again, back to our friendly River the Yantic, with the gauge location at the top of the red arrow in the downstream watershed where my river center was quite accurately predicting a major flood there about 24 hours in advance. And we were able, with the help of the emergency managers, to get a couple of photos and actually be able to zoom in and quantify how accurate these forecasts were to validate the techniques that we're using to derive this type of information. So at the end of the day, what we're hoping to be able to deliver starting in 2023, and then developing this capability over the next 3 to 5 years, is to now go from being able to provide river predictions to being able to complement that information with these inundation services. And it's not just going to be a static map. We want to deliver this in a true GIS framework. So the emergency management community can overlay their critical infrastructure, the evacuation routes, the evacuation locations, and begin to identify where their choke points are. And I look at this as we build more history with these types of services, that they could be complementary to things like the FEMA floodplain maps, your 100-year, 500-year floodplains, to help communities identify where their real trouble spots are when we have these flood events. So I will end there. I'm sure